Right, welcome. So in this short discussion, I just want to talk a little bit about the other two readings that you have for this week, with a particular focus on Eva Meier's Goose Politics. So both of the other readings that you have for this week, in addition to the Donaldson and Kumiko reading, engage with questions around animals who defy typical rigid categories, namely the categories of domesticated or wild. So these are animals which complicate conventional understandings. And of course, the situation is already complicated when thinking about the moral standing of domesticated and wild animals. But we want to think about what about those animals that don't necessarily fall within these like neatly formed categories, right? So Eva Meyer shows, I think, pretty well, right, that typically these species, often referred to as liminal, are the least legally recognized, are the least like morally kind of recognized beings. Yet, as you will see in the piece that I wrote that you're reading for this week, the European hamsters, at least that live in Vienna, Austria, are in some ways, they have almost like an increased kind of moral standing because of their liminal status and their proximity to humans, right? So this is a space to think critically. It's not to make the claim that liminal species are necessarily always in a situation where they are, granted like lower legal standing or lower moral standing, but just that these are like really interesting spaces to think in. So this is a space to think critically, right? So as Meyer writes, liminal species are often seen as, pests or intruders. So we might think here of, for example, rats or mice, right? But yet, simultaneously, we have situations where other beings who are other animals who are, could be understood as liminal are seemingly brought to a higher moral standing because of that status, right? And as I mentioned, right, certainly that's the case with the European hamster, which, as you see in my piece, I discussed this, right, that they receive pretty strict protections, legal protections, at least in Austria and some other countries in Western Europe. And particularly in Vienna, Austria, they're seen as sort of a point of pride for many people there, right? And it is the case that there's, some criticism, right? I mean, in some cases, multi-million euro projects have been put on hold because of a concern for these animals, right? And a sensitivity to their well-being, right? And so their protection is obviously going to be critiqued by some people, but by and large, what's kind of fascinating is that it's generally not seen as that controversial by the vast majority of people, at least in the context of Vienna, Austria. So I was thinking an example that we could think of a liminal species here, particularly in Oregon or in the United States, right? That has sort of perhaps higher moral standing, or like we perhaps have a closer sensitivity to because of their liminal status, would be like backyard birds, right? Like birds that visit your feeder perhaps in the backyard. So many species, many liminal species thrive, for example, because of the presence of humans. So Anna's hummingbirds are a really good example of this. For example, right, they only live this far north until somewhere around 100 years or so ago. Anna's hummingbirds typically didn't go further north than the San Francisco Bay Area. And the reason that they've gone farther north, and that they now live up into Canada, and certainly they live here in Oregon, is because humans planted exotic flowering plants, non-native flowering plants, which provide a food source for the hummingbirds, as well as many people like myself, right, have put out hummingbird feeders for these birds that they've become sort of reliant on now. So it's an interesting case. But let's return to Eva Meyer's piece on goose politics and just talk a little bit about this. So what she presents in this piece is quite an interesting analysis of some different contexts through which to think about the ways in which the agency and the moral standing of geese is exemplified. And so for one, she does I think, quite a good job of showing a hermeneutical perspective, which is going to relate way back to week one and the Martin Drenton reading on environmental hermeneutics. So remember that environmental hermeneutics is an approach that studies the ways in which we interpret environments and space, and sort of pushes against the idea that there can really be a truly neutral or unbiased interpretation of the world, right? That's not, indeed, that's not possible, right? We are always already informed by some pre-existing conditions which shape our perception, okay? And so Meijer shows quite well that the history that led to the ways in which the geese at the Schiphol airport in Amsterdam were interpreted, that there's a long history of, going from, at some point they were invited into these spaces and they were seen as rare and beautiful, but over time they became demonized, treated as enemies, and tragically killed by the thousands, right? But what else is happening in this chapter, right? So Meyer's also really demonstrating what it would mean to think deeper about the presence of other animals, to consider how their agency can be interpreted, right? So this is crucial on her account because this is just one example among many in which humans and other animals need to figure out ways to live together productively. So we want to ask, what would it mean to take seriously that animals such as these geese are not objects or things, but rather are beings who are in dialogue with us, and we can choose to listen or be perceptive to the communicative capacities of these beings, right? So certainly, as she shows, this would mean taking serious research on the communication capacities of other animals from, for example, cognitive ethologists or animal behaviorists, right? So in this account, an ethical relationship in many ways requires us to take seriously the science of animal behavior, and to want to understand animals better, not to just go through the world sort of uninformed about the capacities and needs and behaviors of other animals, right? And so this also means considering the ways in which humans and other animals have been in mutually beneficial relationships in the past and the present. And she gives some good examples of that as well, right? So what about Meyer's discussion of political agency? So from pages 173 on, this is really the focus of her piece. And in this section, she discusses different forms of social political interaction and how we might reimagine the ways in which relationships between, in this case, geese and humans are playing out. And of course, there are countless cases where we might take Meyer's reasoning and think through other interactions between humans and animals. So for example, I cite Meyer's work in this chapter in the paper you're also reading this week, that I wrote on the European hamster. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this lecture, since I anticipate our discussion board will be quite productive this week in regard to this, since you're going to be writing your discussions on either the Goose Politics piece by Eva Meijer or my piece on the Viennese hamsters. But the examples that Eva Meijer gives, I want to talk just a little bit about that. So she gives, examples of cases in the human context, right? So for example, foot voting, right? So this is like a, relocation based on a need to escape a harmful situation, right? So of course, as Meijer mentions, in many cases, this is based simply on a survival need, right? But so we consider, right, we could consider here the cases of like human refugee communities. The refugees might be relocating for many reasons, and it's often not the case that they're relocating to sort of make an explicitly intended political statement. But regardless of this intention to make a political statement or the lack thereof, it often is the case that their relocation makes a profound political statement. And so she raises that point. So because if we're thinking in the context of other animals, we might ask if the intention to communicate one's position is always really that crucial to know. Does it really matter, for example, if one intends to make a statement, regardless of if we interpret it that way, right? So the geese are, on her account, communicating their agency, and they're communicating a sort of claim on space, regardless of if they are actually saying it in a language that we typically would recognize. Okay, so in many ways, we can also interpret the fact that these animals are probably, they're probably not able to access the dominant forms of language or communication, the sort of acceptable forms, largely acceptable forms of communication within the context of humans. We can say that if they're not able to access those forms of communication, that actually communicates their marginalized state in an even more profound way, right? And so this is the same in some sense with the example of squatting, like taking up residence in oftentimes, illegal residence in abandoned properties, right? And so this is another example that Meijer uses. And of course, this is also often done out of simply a need for shelter, but it's also frequently done in the context of making a political statement. So how might we reconsider the ways in which other animals are expressing their claim on space? How might that reconsideration change our ethical relationships with them? So this is really the crux of what she's discussing here. How would this change our interpretation of the law or our application of future laws, right? Or like this is crucial questions to ask. So keep all this in mind, because for next week, we will be engaging with a more close discussion related to legal considerations of other species. So what would it mean to provide a deliberative space for different forms of communication? This is another crucial question that Eva Meijer is asking in this piece. So for example, taking into account the diversity of both human and more than human positions, right? So oftentimes, dominant political discourse is centrist, if we were to use a terminology from Plumwood that we read about recently, right? It is formed through this dominant normative structure, which oftentimes leaves out the voices and perspectives of most humans, let alone, and certainly, right, leaves out the perspectives and interests of most animals, right? So what if we provided a deliberative space that attempted to account for both the diversity of human and more than human perspectives? So another really fascinating point that she brings up in this chapter, right, is that really the ways in which we think about space and the distribution of other beings on this planet are also often quite ethically anthropocentric and exclusionary. So think about what you think about, like, what are your thoughts, for example, on her discussion of the way in which land is mapped out, the way in which we map and like kind of conceptualize the distribution of land, in ways that oftentimes leave out a consideration of more than human communities, right, and their presence on that land. As she shows, it seems like animals certainly often do have something at least somewhat akin to what we might consider a map, or like a pattern of trends in which they've related to a particular geographic space. Okay, so in terms of thinking about this again in a local context, I'll just bring up birds again, because I think this is a pretty interesting example. So was thinking about this because there's a lot of mapping that's being done of bird migrations using radar technology. So this is radar technology that's oftentimes has been used, similar to what's been used to predict, for example, weather patterns and so forth, and forecast weather. So through this technology, we are also able to predict when large numbers of birds will be migrating over certain urban areas. And since the vast majority of birds migrate at night, this is really important to think about, because urban lights are a concern. Lights in buildings, especially in very tall skyscrapers in large cities, are a concern because, first of all, they interfere with a bird's ability to, for example, see the sky, see the stars, which aids in their navigation. but they also disorient the birds. And so many birds die or are seriously injured as a result of running, flying into buildings. And so the use of this kind of mapping technology, which attempts to consider not just human presence, but also maps out the presence of other animals, this technology could actually provides forecasts of bird migrations, which could allow us to minimize conflicts between humans and other animals, in particular, those sort of conflicts that arise in the context of, their migration and large numbers of them being killed in large cities because of the use of lights, right? And perhaps if we knew this and we knew how many birds were traveling over at certain times of the year, especially certain days, cities could turn off the lights on those particular days. And this is something that, for example, the Audubon Society has been really the protective organization for developed to protect birds, protect wild birds. This organization and other conservation organizations have been pushing this. That there are certain times when cities should turn off their lights to assist the migratory kind of to take into account the migratory paths of these birds. Okay. So as Meijer ends the piece, she shows that although animal agency is oftentimes not accounted for in human political institutions, certainly this is the case within the consideration of the gray-lag geese at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. Animal agency is oftentimes not accounted for, but there is significant potential in applying some of the proposals that she puts forward in this piece. And so this is actually a part of what I attempted to do in the piece on the hamsters that you're reading this week that I wrote, is that really, although the statement, I want to say that although the statement is not usually explicitly being made, there are some clear examples in which the political agency of other animals is taken seriously. And so this is, I think, the example of the European hamster's presence in Vienna, Austria is a really good case to look at this. It seems like their claim, their sort of, if we were to interpret them as political agents, it seems like there is a recognition that they have a legitimate claim on this space, and even government institutions are attempting to account for this. They have, for example, a person referred to as a hamster commissioner, as you read in my piece, who is responsible to ensure that whenever new buildings are developed and built on land that's near where hamsters are living, they want to ensure that no hamsters are harmed or put through undue stress as a result of this. So yeah, there seems to be a recognition of their political claim on this space then, right? So with that, I'm going to conclude this brief discussion, but I just want to say I'm really looking forward to our discussion this week on this topic that I think hopefully you will find as fascinating and as compelling as I do. Okay, thank you.